Picture this. It's a cold December night in the 1940s, and prison guards are gathering for their annual Christmas party at Warden Johnston's house on Alcatraz Island. The fire crackles warmly in the Ben Franklin stove, laughter fills the room, and for a moment, the harsh reality of their daily lives seems forgotten. But then, without warning, a figure materializes in the doorway. A man in Victorian clothing with mutton chop sideburns and a gray suit that belongs to another century. The temperature plummets so violently that grown men's breath becomes visible in seconds. The fire dies instantly, as if snuffed out by invisible hands. And before anyone can speak, before anyone can move, the figure vanishes, leaving behind only the suffocating silence of terror and the undeniable knowledge that some places never let go of their dead. But who was this man? And what does his appearance tell us about the true nature of Alcatraz? A place where the boundary between the living and the dead has been shattered beyond repair. Welcome to a journey into the darkest corners of human suffering, where concrete and steel have absorbed decades of despair, rage, and death. If you're here seeking simple ghost stories, you've come to the wrong place. What we're about to explore transcends the supernatural. It's about the terrifying reality of how places can become repositories of human anguish, how pain can seep into the very foundations of a structure and remain there long after the last scream has echoed through empty corridors. Before we dive into this abyss, I need you to understand something. This channel exists to uncover the truths that others won't touch, to examine the shadows that conventional wisdom refuses to acknowledge. If you're ready to question everything you think you know about life, death, and the spaces between them, then subscribe now, because what you're about to hear will change how you see the world forever. Alcatraz Island sits like a wound in the San Francisco Bay, a 22-acre scar of rock and reinforced concrete that has witnessed more human suffering per square foot than perhaps any other location in North America. But what makes Alcatraz truly terrifying isn't its history as America's most notorious federal prison. It's the growing evidence that the island has become something far more sinister, a place where the dead refuse to leave, where the very atmosphere crackles with the residual energy of broken souls who served their time but never found their freedom. The Native Americans who lived in the Bay Area for thousands of years called it Evil Island, believing it was inhabited by malevolent spirits long before the first European ever set foot on its shores. They used it as a place of ultimate punishment, banishing their worst criminals to live alone among what they knew to be supernatural entities that fed on human despair. They understood something that we, in our modern arrogance, have forgotten. Some places are simply wrong, cosmically misaligned with the natural order, and Alcatraz is one of them. From 1934 to 1963, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary housed 1,576 of America's most dangerous criminals, men whose names still echo through the halls of infamy. Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, Robert Stroud the Birdman, and countless others whose crimes had shocked a nation. But the true horror of Alcatraz wasn't the criminals it contained, it was what it did to them. The prison was designed with one purpose: to break the human spirit so completely that even the most hardened killers would emerge as hollow shells of their former selves. The cells measured just 4.5 by 10 feet, barely larger than a modern bathroom, with a view of San Francisco Bay that served as a constant reminder of the freedom that lay just 1.5 miles away, but might as well have been on another planet. Imagine spending 19 to 24 hours a day in that concrete box, listening to the sounds of life continuing without you, the laughter from yacht parties, the music from the city, the everyday conversations of people who still had hope for tomorrow. The psychological torture was intentional, calculated, and devastatingly effective. but it was in the depths of Alcatraz, in a place the inmates called the Hole, where the true darkness revealed itself. D Block, the solitary confinement unit, contained 42 cells designed to strip away the last vestiges of humanity from those who dared to break the prison's rules. 5 of these cells were known as the worst of the worst, windowless steel boxes where prisoners were stripped naked and left in complete darkness for days at a time. No sink, no toilet except for a hole in the floor, no human contact except for the guards who delivered meager rations through a slot in the door. The silence in these cells was absolute, a living thing that pressed against the eardrums and drove strong men to madness. It was here, in cell 14D, that something happened in the 1940s that defies rational explanation and forces us to confront the possibility that human suffering can literally tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. The prisoner's name has been lost to history, but his final hours remain etched in the testimonies of guards who worked that night shift. He had been placed in 14D for some minor infraction, thrown into that steel tomb where the temperature hovered just above freezing, and the darkness was so complete it seemed to have weight. At first, he was quiet, accepting his punishment as so many before him had done. But as the hours passed, something changed. The guards began to hear him talking, not to himself, but to someone else, someone who wasn't there. His voice grew increasingly agitated, then terrified, as he described a presence in the cell with him, something with glowing red eyes that moved in the shadows beyond shadows. The guards dismissed it as hallucinations brought on by sensory deprivation, a common occurrence in the hole. But then the screaming started. For hours, this man screamed with a terror so primal, so absolute, that seasoned guards, men who had seen the worst that humanity could offer, found themselves unable to sleep for days afterward. He begged for mercy, pleaded with the thing in his cell to leave him alone, described being touched by hands that left no marks but burned like ice. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the screaming stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been, a pregnant quiet that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. When the guards finally opened the cell the next morning, they found the prisoner dead, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Strange marks around his neck that couldn't have been self-inflicted. The official cause of death was listed as strangulation, but no explanation was ever given for how a man alone in a locked cell could strangle himself with invisible hands. But Cell 14D's hunger for human suffering didn't end with that unnamed prisoner's death. Today, more than 60 years after Alcatraz closed its doors as a federal prison, visitors to the island report that 14D remains consistently 20 degrees colder than any other cell in the block. Park rangers refuse to enter it alone, and those brave enough to step inside describe an immediate sense of oppression, as if the air itself has become thick with accumulated anguish. Psychics and paranormal investigators who have visited the cell report overwhelming sensations of terror, visions of a small man with his head shaved, his legs broken by guards, left to die in the darkness while something inhuman fed on his fear. The corner where prisoners would huddle for warmth still radiates a cold that cuts through winter clothing and settles in the bones of anyone who dares to stand there. Would you be willing to spend a night alone in Cell 14D? Could you handle the suffocating darkness, the unnatural cold, the knowledge that you're standing in a place where human suffering reached such depths that it apparently opened a doorway to something that should not exist? These aren't idle questions. They go to the heart of what makes Alcatraz so profoundly disturbing. This isn't just a building where bad things happened. It's a place where the boundaries between our world and something far darker have been permanently damaged. But Cell 14D was just one node in a vast network of suffering that permeated every inch of Alcatraz. Al Capone, perhaps America's most famous gangster, spent nearly 5 years on the island, and even he, a man who had orchestrated mass murder and built an empire on violence, was broken by the relentless psychological pressure. Capone found solace in only one thing: music. He learned to play the banjo and would practice for hours in the prison showers, the only place where he felt safe from the constant threat of violence from other inmates. The acoustics in those tiled chambers amplified the gentle sounds of his instrument, creating a brief respite from the harsh reality of prison life. But when syphilis began destroying his mind, even music couldn't protect him from the horrors that followed him wherever he went. Guards reported finding Capone cowering in corners, begging forgiveness from invisible figures, screaming at ghosts that only he could see. He claimed to be haunted by James Clark, one of the victims of the St. Valentine's Day massacre, and would often be heard pleading with Jimmy to leave him alone. Was this merely the ravings of a mind destroyed by disease, or had Capone's crimes created a supernatural debt that followed him even into the supposed sanctuary of his music? Today, decades after Capone's death, visitors to Alcatraz report hearing the faint sound of banjo music drifting through the empty shower areas. Park rangers have investigated these reports countless times, always finding the showers empty, the tiles cold and silent. Yet the music continues, a melancholy melody that speaks of a soul trapped between worlds, forever seeking the peace that music once provided but can no longer deliver. The supernatural manifestations at Alcatraz extend far beyond individual cells or shower areas. The island itself seems to pulse with residual energy from decades of human anguish. In the laundry room of Cell Block C, psychics consistently report overwhelming sensations of violence and death. This is where A.B. Maldowitz, known as the Butcher, was brutally murdered by fellow inmates in the 1940s. Security cameras have captured unexplained movements in this area, and guards report smelling phantom smoke that appears and disappears without any physical source. The Butcher's presence is so strong that even skeptical investigators have been forced to acknowledge that something unnatural lingers in that confined space. Perhaps most disturbing of all are the reports from Cell Block C's utility corridor, where 3 inmates, Bernard Coy, Joseph Kretzer, and Marvin Hubbard, died during a violent escape attempt in 1946. Their deaths mark the end of one of the bloodiest riots in American prison history, a 48-hour siege that required the intervention of U.S. Marines. Visitors to this area report hearing the sounds of that long-ago battle: gunshots, screaming, the metallic clang of prison bars being struck by bullets. But when security responds to these reports, they find nothing but empty corridors and the echo of their own footsteps. The dead, it seems, are doomed to replay their final moments for eternity, trapped in a loop of violence that refuses to end. The psychological impact of Alcatraz wasn't limited to its inmates. Guards who worked on the island for extended periods reported disturbing changes in their own mental state. Many began experiencing nightmares, depression, and inexplicable feelings of dread that followed them home. Some claimed to see shadowy figures moving through the prison corridors during their night shifts, figures that disappeared when approached but left behind an overwhelming sense of malevolence. The island's isolation, combined with the constant exposure to human suffering, created a toxic environment that affected everyone who spent significant time there. Dr. Marion King, a psychiatrist who studied conditions at Alcatraz in the 1950s, documented what he called existential erosion, a gradual breakdown of the human spirit that occurred not through physical torture, but through the systematic removal of hope, dignity, and human connection. His notes, discovered decades later, paint a picture of an institution that was less interested in rehabilitation than in demonstrating the absolute power of the state to crush the individual will. The prisoners at Alcatraz weren't just serving time. They were being slowly erased, their humanity stripped away layer by layer until only empty shells remained. This systematic dehumanization may explain why so many spirits seem unable to leave Alcatraz. When a person's sense of self is destroyed so completely, perhaps death itself becomes just another form of imprisonment. The ghosts of Alcatraz aren't just the remnants of people who died on the island. They're the fragments of souls that were broken long before their physical deaths. These aren't the peaceful spirits of folklore, but tormented entities trapped in an endless cycle of suffering that mirrors their earthly existence. The electromagnetic anomalies recorded throughout Alcatraz provide scientific support for these supernatural claims. Teams of paranormal investigators have documented temperature fluctuations of up to 30 degrees within individual cells, electromagnetic field spikes that occur without any electrical explanation, and audio recordings that capture voices speaking in languages that none of the living participants understood. These phenomena aren't random. They cluster around specific locations where the most severe psychological and physical abuse occurred. It's as if the island itself has become a recording device, preserving the moments of greatest human anguish for endless replay. Former inmates who survived their time on Alcatraz often spoke of a sensation they couldn't adequately describe, a feeling that the island was watching them, evaluating them, feeding on their despair. Many reported that even decades after their release, they continued to have nightmares about the place, dreams so vivid and terrifying that they would wake up screaming. Some claimed to feel the presence of the island calling to them, a malevolent force that wanted them to return. Several former inmates, despite being free men, eventually took their own lives, unable to escape the psychological prison that Alcatraz had built inside their minds. The Native American understanding of Alcatraz as a place of evil spirits takes on new meaning when viewed through this lens. Perhaps they recognized something that modern society, with its emphasis on rational explanation and scientific method, has been reluctant to accept, that certain locations can become so saturated with negative energy that they develop a malevolent consciousness of their own. Alcatraz isn't just haunted, it's alive, a predatory entity that feeds on human suffering and continues to hunger long after its official purpose has ended. In 1984, renowned psychic Sylvia Browne visited Alcatraz with the CBS News crew and an ex-convict named Leon Thompson. Her goal was to make contact with the spirits that supposedly inhabited the island, and, if possible, to help them find peace. What she discovered instead was something far more disturbing than she had anticipated. In the laundry room, where the butcher had been murdered, Browne immediately sensed what she described as aggressive malevolence. Not the confused spirit of a murder victim, but something that had been drawn to the violence and had made the location its permanent home. When she attempted to communicate with this entity, urging it to move on to whatever awaited beyond death, it refused. The presence, she reported, had no interest in peace or redemption. It was sustained by the residual suffering that permeated the building and had no intention of leaving its feeding ground. During a seance conducted in the prison hospital, Browne made contact with what she believed to be the spirit of Robert Stroud, the infamous Birdman of Alcatraz, who had spent over a decade in the facility's medical wing. But even this seemingly benign contact took a dark turn when Stroud's spirit began describing the feeders, entities that weren't human and had never been human, creatures that were drawn to places of intense suffering like moths to flame. According to Browne's account, these feeders had been present on Alcatraz long before it became a prison, waiting in the island's rocky foundations for the feast of anguish that was to come. The Native Americans' warnings about evil spirits weren't metaphorical. They were literal descriptions of parasitic entities that had made the island their hunting ground. This revelation casts the Christmas ghost incident in an entirely different light. remember that Victorian figure who appeared at Warden Johnston's party, the man whose presence extinguished the fire and filled the room with supernatural cold. Perhaps this wasn't the spirit of a former resident at all, but one of these feeders taking on human form to better blend with its environment. The mutton chop, sideburns, and period clothing could have been a disguise, a mask worn by something inhuman to avoid detection while it stalked through the prison, feeding on the despair of guards and inmates alike. The fact that it appeared during a moment of celebration, when the guards were briefly happy and relaxed, suggests a malevolent intelligence that took pleasure in destroying even the smallest moments of human joy. Modern paranormal investigators have documented phenomena that support this disturbing theory. Electronic devices malfunction in specific patterns throughout Alcatraz, with batteries draining rapidly in areas where the most severe abuse occurred. Infrared cameras capture heat signatures that move through the prison in ways that suggest intelligence and purpose, shadows that seem to actively avoid detection while stalking human visitors. Most telling of all are the electromagnetic readings that spike whenever groups of tourists become particularly emotional during their visits, as if something is feeding on their fear, sadness, or excitement, growing stronger with each display of human feeling. The question that haunts every serious researcher who has studied Alcatraz isn't whether the island is haunted. The evidence for supernatural activity is overwhelming and undeniable. The real question is far more terrifying. What happens to the people who visit Alcatraz and unknowingly become prey for these entities? Reports from tourists who have taken the island's night tours describe persistent nightmares that begin shortly after their visit, dreams filled with the sounds of cell doors slamming, men screaming in languages they don't understand, and the sensation of being watched by invisible eyes. Some visitors report that these dreams continue for months or even years after their visit, as if something from the island has followed them home. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a sleep researcher at Stanford University, has documented over 200 cases of what she terms Alcatraz-induced parasomnia, severe sleep disturbances that begin after visiting the island and persist long after the visit has ended. Her patients describe remarkably similar nightmares, finding themselves trapped in cell 14D while something with glowing eyes circles them in the darkness, hearing Al Capone's banjo music growing louder and more discordant until it becomes unbearable, or being pursued through empty prison corridors by figures in Victorian clothing who move with inhuman speed and grace. The consistency of these reports across hundreds of unrelated individuals suggests that something on Alcatraz is capable of forming lasting connections with visitors, hooks that allow it to continue feeding on their psychic energy long after they've returned to the mainland. Think about this for a moment. If you've never visited Alcatraz, how do you know you're safe? If these entities can form psychic connections with people who merely set foot on the island, what's to stop them from reaching out to anyone who shows enough interest in their domain? Perhaps simply by watching this video, by allowing yourself to become emotionally invested in the stories of Alcatraz's victims, you've already caught their attention. Are you experiencing any unusual dreams lately? Any sense of being watched when you're alone? Any inexplicable feelings of dread that seem to come from nowhere? These could be the first signs that something from that cursed island has taken notice of you. The most disturbing aspect of the Alcatraz phenomenon is its apparent intelligence and adaptability. Unlike traditional hauntings, which tend to be repetitive and predictable, the entities on Alcatraz seem to learn from each encounter, becoming more sophisticated in their methods of psychological manipulation. Early reports from the 1960s and 70s described relatively simple manifestations: cold spots, strange sounds, brief visual apparitions. But as more people visited the island and more psychic investigators studied the phenomena, The manifestations became increasingly complex and personalized. It's as if these entities were studying human psychology, learning what fears and anxieties were most effective for harvesting psychic energy. Contemporary visitors report experiences tailored to their specific phobias and traumas. Claustrophobic individuals find themselves overwhelmed by the sensation of walls closing in, even in the prison's more open areas. Those with a fear of drowning report feeling as if they're underwater while walking through perfectly dry corridors. People who have experienced violence in their own lives describe being psychically bombarded with images of the beatings, stabbings, and murders that occurred within the prison walls. These targeted attacks suggest that the entities of Alcatraz have developed the ability to read human minds, extracting personal information that they then use to maximize their victims' psychological distress. The prison's closure in 1963 didn't end the suffering. It merely changed its nature. Without inmates to torment, the entities that had fed on human misery for 3 decades were forced to adapt or starve. They chose adaptation. The transformation of Alcatraz into a tourist attraction provided them with a steady stream of new victims, people who came to the island voluntarily, their minds already primed with expectations of supernatural encounters. Tourism, in effect, became a form of ritualized feeding, with each guided tour serving as a ceremony that channeled fresh psychic energy to the hungry entities lurking in the shadows. This revelation forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about our fascination with places like Alcatraz. When we visit sites of historical trauma for entertainment, are we merely tourists seeking thrills, or are we unwitting participants in a cosmic form of exploitation? Every dollar spent on Alcatraz tickets, every photograph taken in Cell 14D, every social media post about the island's haunted history contributes to the perpetuation of a cycle that began with the Native Americans' warnings and continues to this day. We have commercialized suffering, turned human anguish into a commodity, and in doing so, we may have given these malevolent entities exactly what they needed to grow stronger. The implications extend far beyond Alcatraz itself. If this analysis is correct, then every haunted location that draws tourists might be operating under similar principles. The Winchester Mystery House, Eastern State Penitentiary, the Tower of London, all sites where human suffering was concentrated and commodified for public consumption. We've created a global network of feeding stations for entities that exist beyond our normal understanding of reality, and we've done it in the name of historical preservation and entertainment. The ghosts aren't trapped in these places. We are, caught in a web of supernatural predation that we've unknowingly woven around ourselves. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Alcatraz phenomenon is its apparent connection to modern forms of psychological imprisonment. The techniques developed on the island, sensory deprivation, social isolation, the systematic destruction of hope, have found new applications in contemporary society. Solitary confinement, once considered an extreme punishment reserved for the worst offenders, is now routine in American prisons. The psychological principles that broke minds on Alcatraz are being refined and applied on a massive scale, creating new reservoirs of human suffering that may be attracting the same type of entities that first claimed the island decades ago. As I finish telling you this story, I want you to consider something. You've now spent considerable time thinking about Alcatraz, visualizing its corridors, imagining the suffering of its inmates. You've opened your mind to the island's dark history and allowed yourself to become emotionally invested in the experiences of people who died in agony decades ago. In doing so, you may have created exactly the type of psychic connection that allows these entities to extend their influence beyond the physical boundaries of the island. The next time you find yourself alone in the dark, listen carefully. Do you hear the faint sound of a banjo playing a melancholy tune? Can you smell the phantom smoke that guards reported in the laundry room? Do you feel the presence of invisible eyes watching you from the shadows? If this exploration into the depths of human suffering and supernatural predation has affected you as deeply as it should, then you need to subscribe to this channel immediately. This isn't a casual request for engagement. It's a warning and an invitation. By subscribing, you'll join a community of people who understand that reality extends far beyond what mainstream society is willing to acknowledge. You'll gain access to investigations that go deeper than surface-level ghost stories, explorations that examine the fundamental nature of existence itself. More importantly, you'll become part of a network of individuals who are actively working to understand and potentially combat the forces that prey on human consciousness. The entities that inhabit places like Alcatraz grow stronger in isolation and ignorance. Knowledge, shared among those brave enough to seek truth, may be our only defense against them. Subscribe now, because the dark forces we've discussed tonight are already aware of your interest. The question isn't whether they'll try to reach you, it's whether you'll be prepared when they do. But I don't want this to be a one-sided conversation. Your experiences, your encounters with the unexplained, your insights into the nature of places that seem to exist outside normal reality, these are crucial pieces of a puzzle that we're all trying to solve together. Have you visited Alcatraz? If so, what did you experience there? More importantly, have you noticed any changes in your dreams, your sleep patterns, or your general sense of well-being since watching this video? I want you to share your stories in the comments below, no matter how strange or inexplicable they might seem. Don't worry about skeptics or people who might dismiss your experiences. This community understands that reality is far stranger and more dangerous than most people realize. Your story might be the key that helps us understand how these entities operate, or it might provide comfort to someone else who has had similar experiences and felt alone with their knowledge. If this video has opened your eyes to truths that you didn't know existed, please like it and share it with others who are ready to confront the darker aspects of our world. Together, we can build a network of awareness that might be our best defense against forces that thrive in secrecy and isolation. Remember, knowledge is power, but shared knowledge is protection. The shadows that lurk in places like Alcatraz fear nothing more than being fully understood and exposed to light. Help us shine that light by sharing your experiences and subscribing to join our growing community of truth seekers. Thank you for having the courage to journey with me into the darkness tonight. Stay vigilant, stay connected, and remember, you are never truly alone as long as you are part of this community.